On July 25th, in a quiet subdivision outside Reno, Nevada, a woman closed on a single-family home. 4 figures for the down payment, a stack of paperwork she signed without reading every line because who does? 2 weeks later, the county assessor's office called to tell her that she did not, in fact, own one house. She owned 86 lots. 84 of them still belonged, legally, to other people who were living in those houses, mowing those lawns, paying those mortgages, to a landlord they didn't know they had, who didn't know she had them either. A single copy-and-paste error in a legal description had handed her a title to a neighborhood. Welcome to Catastrophe Theory, where we figure out exactly how fast your life falls apart if you actually let the intrusive thoughts win. I'm CJ Theory, and today we're looking at what happens when you accidentally buy an entire suburb. You are sitting at a folding table in a room that smells like burnt coffee and printer toner. There is a stack of paper in front of you, roughly the height of a paperback novel. And somewhere around page 40, you stopped reading the words and started just looking for the little yellow tabs that say, "Sign here." Your realtor is smiling. The title agent is smiling. Everyone in this room is smiling because everyone in this room, except you, does this every single week. To them, this is Tuesday. To you, this is the biggest financial decision of your adult life, compressed into 90 minutes of initialing. Somewhere in that stack is a single paragraph called a legal description. It is not a street address. It is not a lot number you'd recognize. It is a string of surveyor's language, meets and bounds, section and township, a sequence of compass bearings and distances that if you actually plotted them out with a pencil would trace the exact boundary of the land you are buying. Nobody reads it. Nobody has ever read it. It exists to be correct, not to be understood. And that gap between a document that exists to be correct and a room full of people who have stopped checking whether it is where this story begins. You sign, you shake hands, you drive to your new house with a set of keys and a feeling of enormous, exhausted relief. That night, you sleep in a house that finally, technically, belongs to you, and the next morning you wake up and do the things new homeowners do. Measure the windows for curtains, figure out which switch controls the porch light, stand in the empty living room and try to picture where the couch will go. None of it feels historic. None of it feels like the beginning of a story anyone would tell. It feels like Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then a string of ordinary days spent unpacking boxes labeled in your own handwriting. You have no idea that somewhere in a county server, a clerk copied the wrong block of text from a template used for a completely different transaction, and that block of text didn't describe your quarter-acre lot. It described 86 of them, every lot on your street, the park, the retention pond, the clubhouse, all of it now sitting under your name, waiting for someone to notice while you're 2 blocks away, arguing with a curtain rod, blissfully unaware that you are, on paper, the largest private landowner in your own neighborhood. I've spent the last several weeks pulling county assessor records, sheriff's auction transcripts, and court filings from cases where ordinary people, not developers, not investors, not anyone looking for this, woke up owning a slice of a town they never intended to buy. Some of them found out in 2 weeks, some found out in 3 years from a city trying to take the land back through eminent domain. I am not a real estate attorney and I am not a surveyor. I am someone who has read entire deed histories the way other people read thrillers, because once you understand how thin the line is between homeowner and accidental landlord of 40 families, you start to see paperwork completely differently. So let's take this apart, piece by piece, the way it actually happens, not the way it sounds like a punchline. Think about the last time you signed something significant, a lease, a loan, a terms of service update you scrolled through in 4 seconds flat. Somewhere buried in the assumption that this is standard, this is fine, everyone signs this, is a small act of trust. Trust that the document matches the deal you actually agreed to. Trust that the people who drafted it did their job correctly. Trust that nobody upstream made a mistake that's about to become permanently, publicly, legally yours. Most of the time, that trust is completely justified. The system moves millions of transactions a year, and the overwhelming majority close exactly as intended. This isn't a story about the system being broken. It's a story about what happens in the tiny percentage of cases where it isn't, and why the ordinary person sitting at that folding table has almost no way of knowing in the moment which kind of transaction they're in. Here's the question that should be sitting with you right now, low in your stomach. If the system that assigns you legal ownership of land runs on documents nobody double-checks, what else in your life is one copy and paste error away from belonging to a stranger? Let's start at the beginning. Not the moment you find out, the moment it actually happens, weeks or months before you have any idea, while you're unpacking boxes and hanging curtains in a house you think is exactly the size you paid for. Part 1 is the error itself, and it almost always starts the same way, with a template. Title companies and county offices process an enormous volume of transactions, and to move fast, they reuse boilerplate. A legal description gets drafted once for a large parcel, say an entire phase of a housing development still owned by the builder, before it's carved into individual lots. In the Nevada case, the agency handling the closing pulled a legal description from a previous Toll Brothers transaction and pasted it without narrowing it to the single lot. The recorded deed read lots 1 through 85 and common areas A and B, not lot 43, not the address on the sign out front. Every lot in the phase, plus the shared spaces. One paste, one missing edit, a signature on top of it, and the county recorder stamps it into public record, because the recorder's job is to file what's presented, not to fact-check the surveyor's math against reality. That's the mechanism, and it's worth sitting with because it reveals something uncomfortable about how property actually works. You don't own your house because you live in it. You don't own it because you have a key, or because your name is on the mailbox, or because you've been paying the mortgage for 6 years. You own it because a specific string of language filed in a specific government office says you do. Possession is a feeling. Title is a fact, a recorded, searchable, legally binding fact, and that fact is created entirely by human beings typing, on deadline, sometimes copying from the wrong file. The house doesn't know who owns it, the dirt doesn't know who owns it, only the paperwork knows, and paperwork is written by people who occasionally, understandably given the sheer volume of transactions running through a title office in any given month, get it wrong. So if the deed is wrong, but you don't know it's wrong, what happens to everyone else who's living inside your accidental empire? Part 2 is the gap, the stretch of time between the error happening and someone catching it. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because during that gap, nothing about daily life changes for anyone. The 84 families in Spanish Springs kept living in their homes. They kept mowing their lawns. Legally, though, for those 2 weeks, their landlord was a stranger who'd bought a single-family home down the block and had absolutely no idea she now held title to the roof over their heads. She wasn't collecting rent. She wasn't evicting anyone. She didn't even know. But if she had known, if some version of this story existed where the new owner realized what had happened and decided to be difficult about it before the county could correct the record, the legal reality is that for those 2 weeks, she had a colorable claim to every one of those properties. Colorable doesn't mean unbeatable. Courts exist precisely to unwind mistakes like this, but the courts will eventually fix it, and nothing bad can happen in the meantime are 2 very different sentences, and the gap between an error being recorded and an error being caught is where the real risk lives. Think about how many transactions touch a piece of property in an ordinary year without anyone rechecking the underlying legal description. A homeowner refinances their mortgage, a utility company renews an easement, an insurance policy gets renewed, a county sends out an annual tax bill. Every single one of those processes pulls from the same underlying record, and every single one of them assumes that record is correct, because re-verifying it from scratch every time would grind the entire system to a halt. That assumption is what makes the system fast. It's also exactly what makes a buried error invisible for so long. Nobody in that entire chain of routine, ordinary transactions is actually looking at the legal description with fresh eyes, asking whether it makes sense. They're looking at whether the paperwork is internally consistent with itself, and an error like this one is, by definition, internally consistent. It says what it says, it's just wrong. In Trenton, Ohio, that gap wasn't 2 weeks, it was 3 years. A man named Jason Fauntleroy went to a Butler County Sheriff's auction in 2021 hoping to buy a vacant lot for $5,000 and build a house on it. What he actually purchased, because of how the parcel was assessed and packaged for auction, was Bloomfield Court, a private cul-de-sac serving 5 existing homes. He didn't just get the empty lot, he got the road itself, the pavement, the easement, the strip of land every one of his new neighbors needed to drive to work every morning. For 3 years, an ordinary man was the private, unofficial landlord of a street he never meant to buy, while the families on it had no idea their daily commute technically ran through someone else's property. It only became a public problem when the city, wanting to convert the private drive into a maintained public street, tried to take it back through eminent domain, and Fauntleroy, understandably, wanted to be paid fairly for what he actually owned, not just the value of the single lot the city had originally assessed. That's the part nobody tells you about accidental land ownership. It isn't a cartoon. There's no dramatic reveal where movers show up at your door with a giant novelty check. It's quiet. It's boring. It sits in a filing cabinet, unnoticed until someone, a tax assessor doing annual reconciliation, a buyer trying to sell a home who discovers a title defect, a city government that suddenly needs the land for something, goes looking and finds the discrepancy. The clock on a mistake like this doesn't start when it's discovered, it starts when it's filed. Everything in between is just borrowed time. And once someone does find it, once the error surfaces, who actually gets to decide what happens to 86 lots or a private street or a water tower that never should have changed hands? Part 3 is the unwind, and this is where the story stops being about paperwork and starts being about power. When a title error this size is discovered, there is no single button anyone presses to fix it. In the Nevada case, resolution came from the title agency itself, Westminster Title, the company that made the original error, issuing corrected documents and working with the county assessor's office to restore what officials called true and rightful ownership back to the appropriate parties. That took about 2 weeks once the mistake was flagged, and it worked cleanly because everyone involved cooperated. The buyer wasn't trying to keep the extra lots, the title company owned its mistake, and the county recorder's office processed the correction without a fight. But cooperation is not guaranteed, and that's the entire lesson of the Trenton, Ohio case. When Fauntleroy's ownership of Bloomfield Court became inconvenient for the city didn't simply ask him to hand it back or offer to buy it at a price reflecting what he actually owned, an entire private street serving 5 homes, not one empty lot. Reporting on the case describes a man who felt shut out, whose calls the city allegedly stopped returning, who watched officials move toward eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use with compensation, while the compensation on the table reflected only the value of his original vacant lot assessment, not the full street he'd legally owned for 3 years. When the party trying to unwind the mistake is a government with the legal authority to simply take land back, fixing an error and being treated fairly are not automatically the same process. One is a filing, the other is a fight. It's worth pausing on what just compensation even means in a case like this, because it's not a fixed number a government simply announces. It's a legal standard, rooted in the idea that when the public takes private property for a public purpose, the individual bearing that loss shouldn't be forced to subsidize everyone else's benefit. Determining it properly usually requires an independent appraisal of the property as it actually exists, not as it was originally assessed for a different purpose years earlier. When a city assesses a lot for one use, then later claims a much larger asset attached to that lot for a completely different use, the gap between those two numbers isn't a technicality, it's the entire dispute. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the Trenton case, an accidental windfall for one ordinary buyer sitting for years unnoticed until it became inconvenient for someone with far more institutional power than he has, and the mechanism meant to protect him in that exact situation is one most people never think about until they're the one standing in it. And the Florida case shows what it looks like when everyone behaves well and it's still messy. In Brooksville, a businessman paid $55,000 for a municipal building, planning to convert it into a gym. When he went to the county for an address, he discovered the parcel he'd purchased included the ground underneath the town's actual water tower, the city's own water infrastructure, accidentally sold off in a bungled legal description. The buyer, to his credit, gave it back voluntarily, transferring the tower to the town through a warranty deed. The city manager took responsibility publicly, saying simply that they were human and had made a mistake. The redevelopment agency director who'd overseen the sale resigned. Nobody sued, nobody fought eminent domain in court. It still took the town publicly admitting fault, a resignation, and the good faith of a stranger who could have made this very difficult to get an entire municipal water tower back into public hands. That's what a clean resolution looks like, and it still required a lot to go right. Part 4 is scale, because everything we've discussed so far is measured in lots, streets, and single buildings. But the same mechanism, a legal description filed and trusted without independent verification, is also how entire towns change hands on purpose. Ghost towns across the American West are bought and sold as single packages regularly. Sweat, South Dakota, a town of roughly 6 acres, including a residence, a tavern, a gas station, and a general store, sat on the market for years at $250,000. Bradian, British Columbia, a former gold mining town, was purchased outright by a businesswoman during an economic downturn and later resold as a long-abandoned property. In Hungary, a private buyer gradually acquired and redeveloped the entire village of Betapusta into an events venue. Families elsewhere in Europe have bought crumbling hamlets outright and spent years turning them into working communities again, one derelict building at a time. These aren't accidents, they're intentional purchases, often for a fraction of what you'd expect, because a town without an economy is, legally, just land with buildings on it and nobody bidding it up. The price tag on an abandoned town reflects the absence of demand, not the absence of scale. You're not paying for less land than a suburb, you're paying for land nobody currently wants to compete for. But every one of those legitimate town sales runs through the exact same fragile process as the Nevada copy-paste error, a legal description drafted by a human being, filed by a county office that trusts the document in front of it. Whether 100 acres change hands because a wealthy buyer wired a deposit and hired a survey crew, or because a title agent grabbed the wrong template at 2 in the afternoon on a busy Friday, the recorder's office processes both filings with the exact same rubber stamp. The difference between buying a ghost town on purpose and accidentally buying a neighborhood by mistake isn't the mechanism, it's intent. The paperwork doesn't know or care which one it's processing. Part 5 is worth a detour because it answers the question you're probably already asking. Why does a system this important still run on a mechanism this fragile? The answer is history. Land recording in most of the United States works on what's called a race notice recording system. Essentially, whoever files their deed at the county office first and does so properly generally has priority over competing claims, and the recorder's job is administrative, not investigative. The recorder checks that a document is formatted correctly and that fees are paid. The recorder does not independently verify that the legal description matches reality, that the seller actually owns what they're selling, or that the acreage listed is correct. That verification work is pushed almost entirely onto title companies and title insurance, private businesses that research the chain of ownership, search for competing claims, and financially guarantee that the title they're insuring is clean. It's a genuinely clever system, built up roughly 2 centuries of American property law, and it's the reason you can buy a house in a week instead of the months it might take a government office to independently resurvey every parcel by hand. But it also means the integrity of any single transaction depends heavily on the diligence of whichever title company or title agency happens to be sitting across the table from you that day. Their training, their workload, their attention on the specific afternoon your file crossed their desk. Some countries use a different model entirely, called a Torrens system, where the government itself guarantees the title and maintains a single authoritative register, shifting more of the verification burden onto the state. The United States, for the most part, didn't go that direction. We built a faster, more decentralized system, and faster, more decentralized systems trade some centralized certainty for speed. The Nevada copy-paste error, the Ohio street, the Florida water tower, these aren't signs of a uniquely broken process. They're the visible edge of a trade-off that was made generations ago, mostly invisibly, mostly successfully, and mostly in your favor every single time you've ever closed on a piece of property without incident. So if the system is a trade-off, built for speed instead of centralized certainty, what does that mean for the beliefs most people walk into a closing already holding? Beliefs that, it turns out, are mostly wrong. Let's clear up what people get wrong about all of this, because the myths here aren't just inaccurate, some of them are the exact kind of thinking that makes a real mistake much worse once it happens. Myth: if you accidentally end up owning someone else's property, you get to keep it, because possession is 9/10 of the law. Reality: recording a deed is not the same as establishing an incontestable legal right to land, especially when the deed itself is provably the product of a clerical error. Why it's false? Courts have well-established doctrines for correcting deeds that misdescribe property due to mutual mistake or clerical error. This is common enough in property law that there's a whole body of case law built around it, and a corrective deed process exists in essentially every U.S. jurisdiction specifically to handle it. The old folk phrase about possession being most of the law refers to disputes where ownership is ambiguous or contested between 2 parties with competing claims, not to situations where a title company can point to its own paperwork and demonstrate exactly where the error occurred. If your ownership exists purely because of a demonstrable copy-paste mistake, "I have the deed" is much weaker position than it sounds, and any attempt to lean on that deed knowing it was a mistake edges out of misunderstanding and into territory that could expose the accidental owner to real legal liability of their own. Myth: the families or homeowners living on land that's been accidentally sold out from under them are at immediate risk of losing their homes. Reality: in every documented case like this, the actual occupants, the people living in the homes, driving on the street, relying on the water tower, were never the ones in legal jeopardy. Why it's false? An accidental transfer of title doesn't erase the underlying rights of people who already have deeds, mortgages, or established legal interests in their specific property. It creates a conflict between the erroneous new title and everyone else's pre-existing valid claims, and existing claims backed by their own recorded documents are exactly what correction processes are designed to protect. The buyer who ends up with an accidental deed to 86 lots doesn't suddenly have the power to evict 84 established homeowners, walk into their houses, or start charging them rent overnight. Doing any of that would itself invite immediate legal action from every one of those homeowners' own title insurers. What the accidental buyer actually has is a mess, a cloud on 84 titles that isn't theirs to resolve, and a very short runway before a title company, a county office, or an alarmed homeowner's attorney starts asking pointed questions. Myth: this kind of error is incredibly rare, a once-in-a-lifetime fluke that will never happen to an ordinary buyer. Reality: it happens often enough that there's a specific, well-worn correction pathway for it, and multiple documented independent cases have surfaced in just the last few years alone. A private street in Ohio, a subdivision in Nevada, a municipal water tower in Florida. Why it's false? The volume of real estate transactions processed every single day, combined with the reliance on templated legal descriptions and manual copy-paste workflows, means the opportunity for this exact kind of error exists constantly. It's not rare because the system is fragile in some exotic, unusual way. It's rare because most errors of this type get caught quickly, before anyone outside the title office ever hears about it, corrected quietly in a follow-up filing that never makes the news. The ones you hear about are simply the ones that slipped past every checkpoint long enough to become visible to the public, which tells you less about how often the mistake happens and more about how rarely it survives that long. Myth: buying a town or neighborhood outright is purely a rich person's fantasy, disconnected from anything an ordinary buyer needs to think about. Reality: while intentionally purchasing an entire town is genuinely a niche, well-funded pursuit, the risk of accidentally acquiring far more land than you intended touches any ordinary buyer at any price point in any transaction involving a legal description you didn't personally verify. Why it's false? The Nevada case involved a standard, unremarkable single-family home purchase, not a wealthy investor, not a commercial developer, just someone buying a house in a normal subdivision. The mechanism that produced an 86-lot deed is identical, structurally, to the mechanism that closes every ordinary home sale in the country. You don't need money or intention to end up on either side of this story. You just need to be in a transaction where nobody catches the error before it's filed. So, here is the part that actually matters. Not what to do if you accidentally buy a suburb, because the odds of that specific scenario are vanishingly small, but what to do to make sure you're never the person discovering 2 weeks or 3 years from now that your paperwork says something you never agreed to. 1. Order a copy of your actual recorded deed after closing, not just the closing documents you signed that day. Title companies and counties occasionally make errors between the signing table and the final recorded document, and the version that legally counts is the one sitting in the public record, not the version in your closing folder. Most counties will mail or email you a certified copy for a small fee once it's recorded, usually a few weeks after closing. Set a calendar reminder. Don't assume the paperwork you initialed is identical to what ends up in the public record. Verify it. 2. Read the legal description, even though it's dense and boring and written in surveyor's shorthand. You don't need to understand every bearing and distance, and you don't need a surveying degree. You need to check 3 things: that the lot or parcel number matches what's on your purchase agreement, that the acreage or square footage is roughly what you expect, and that the description doesn't reference any lots, blocks, or common areas beyond the single property you're buying. If you see a number range, like lots 1 through anything, where you expected a single lot number, stop and ask questions before you sign. 3. Cross-reference the lot number and address against the county assessor's public parcel map before you sign anything. Most counties have this online now. free, searchable by address, often called a GIS map or parcel viewer. It takes about 5 minutes and it will immediately show you the actual shape and boundaries of the parcel on record, letting you visually confirm it matches the property you toured and agreed to buy. 4. Purchase an owner's title insurance policy, separate from the lender's policy if you're financing the purchase. Lender's title insurance protects the bank's interest, not yours. If there's a defect in the title, the bank gets made whole and you're on your own. Owner's title insurance is what protects you personally if a defect, including a clerical error like this one, surfaces after closing, and it's often available for a modest one-time premium paid at closing rather than an ongoing cost. Ask for it explicitly if it isn't already in your closing package. 5. If anything about your closing feels rushed, if they're being handed a stack of paper and told to just sign where the tabs are, ask for time. You are legally entitled to review closing documents before signing them, and in many places you're entitled to receive a preview of the closing disclosure and legal description several days in advance. A title agent who's uncomfortable giving you 15 extra minutes to actually read a legal description is telling you something about how carefully that document was prepared in the first place, and it's worth listening to that discomfort. 6. If you ever discover a title discrepancy, extra lots, missing acreage, boundaries that don't match, contact the title company that handled your closing immediately, in writing, and request a corrective deed. Don't wait to see if it resolves itself. Errors like this don't fix themselves. They sit quietly in the public record, unnoticed and unchanged, until someone with the standing and the paperwork to fix them actually acts on it. The longer an error sits uncorrected, the more complicated the eventual fix tends to become. 7. If you're on the other side of this, if you're an existing homeowner and you learn that a neighboring transaction accidentally swept up land that includes your property or your access road, don't panic and don't confront the new owner directly first. Contact your own title insurance company and the county recorder's office. Your existing, validly recorded deed is your strongest protection, and the people whose job is to untangle this, title insurers, recorders, real estate attorneys, are the ones equipped to do it correctly and quickly, without turning it into a personal standoff with a neighbor who may not even realize anything is wrong. 8. Understand eminent domain before you ever need to. Because if you ever end up owning land a government body wants back, a street, a utility easement, anything adjacent to public infrastructure, you are entitled to just compensation reflecting the actual value of what you own, not a lowball figure based on an earlier, narrower assessment. Get an independent appraisal of the full property, not just the portion the government initially assessed. Don't accept the first number a government offers as the final word, and don't assume that because the other party is a city or county, the number they've proposed is automatically fair or final. 9. If you're the buyer who accidentally receives windfall land that clearly isn't yours, extra lots, a water tower, a street full of someone else's houses, do what the Florida businessman did. Give it back voluntarily, promptly, and in writing through a proper corrective deed. It is the fastest way to resolve the situation, it protects you from any future legal exposure or accusations of bad faith, and frankly, it's the only decent thing to do with property that was never supposed to be yours in the first place. Acting quickly and transparently also puts you in a far better position if anything about the transaction is ever scrutinized later. 10. Keep every piece of paper. Every closing document, every recorded deed, every piece of correspondence with a title company or county office, every email confirming a phone call. In every case we've looked at, resolution depended on someone being able to point precisely to where and how the error occurred. A clean paper trail is the difference between a 2-week correction handled by 2 cooperating institutions and a 3-year fight that ends up needing a lawyer, a court date, and a news crew to sort out. 11. If you're ever genuinely uncertain about anything in a closing package, a legal description that seems off, an assessed value that doesn't match what you agreed to pay, a document referencing a name or address you don't recognize, pay for 30 minutes of a real estate attorney's time before you sign, not after. It is a tiny fraction of the cost of unwinding a mistake once it's recorded, and a second set of trained eyes on unfamiliar language is in nearly every one of these stories the one thing that was missing at the moment it mattered most. Here's the thing worth sitting with as we close this out. And it's not really about real estate at all. It's about how much of ordinary life runs on systems we trust without checking, systems built and operated by people doing repetitive work on deadline, at scale, who are right an overwhelming majority of the time and occasionally, understandably, human. A title office processes thousands of transactions. A county recorder files thousands of deeds. The fact that errors like this are rare enough to make the news, rather than common enough to be background noise, is actually evidence the system works far better than the alternative, a world with no recorded titles at all, where ownership is whatever you can physically defend. It would be easy to walk away from a story like this feeling like property ownership is a house of cards, like the ground under your actual house could shift beneath you because of some clerk's copy-paste mistake 3 counties over. I'd ask you to reframe that. What this story actually demonstrates is a system with built-in correction mechanisms that work repeatedly, even when the mistake is enormous. 86 lots corrected in 2 weeks, a municipal water tower returned by a stranger who didn't even fight for it, a private street tangled in a 3-year dispute, genuinely the hardest case we looked at, that is still ultimately working its way through a legal process designed specifically for exactly this kind of disagreement. Every one of these stories ends with the system doing what it's supposed to do, just not always as fast or as painlessly as the people caught inside it would like it. The fear underneath all of this is really a fear of powerlessness, the idea that something as fundamental as where you live could be decided by a document you never read, filed by a person you'll never meet. That fear is valid. It's also exactly why the checklist we just went through exists. Reading your deed, checking the parcel map, buying owner's title insurance. These aren't paranoid habits. They're the 5 or 10 minutes of attention that turn you from someone a mistake happens to into someone who catches a mistake before it has the chance to happen at all. Consider, too, what these stories say about the people involved once the mistake is out in the open. A businessman in Florida who quietly handed a water tower back to the town it needed it because it was clearly the right thing to do. A title agency in Nevada that owned its error, corrected it, and restored 84 families proper ownership within 2 weeks. Even the harder case in Ohio, a man still fighting as of this recording for fair compensation for a street he legitimately owned, is a story about a system with a process for that fight, not a story about a man with no recourse at all. None of these are tales of institutions covering up mistakes and hoping nobody noticed. They're tales of mistakes surfacing, being named plainly, and being worked through by people using tools that already existed for exactly this purpose. That itself is worth something. A system that hides its errors is frightening. A system that occasionally produces strange human errors and then visibly, publicly corrects them is closer to trustworthy than most of us give it credit for on an ordinary Tuesday. There's a version of this story that plays out in miniature in almost every life, even for people who never buy real estate at all. A bank account opened with the wrong beneficiary because of a form filled out in a hurry, a will drafted years ago that never got updated after a divorce, a subscription that auto-renewed because nobody read the fine print on year 1. The suburb-sized version is dramatic and shareable, precisely because the scale makes the underlying lesson impossible to ignore, but the lesson itself is smaller and more universal than any single headline. The documents governing your life are only as accurate as the last person who checked them, and very often nobody has checked them in years. That's not a reason for dread, it's a reason to build the habit of checking the ones that matter most, on the timeline that matters most. At closing, at renewal, at any moment a document is about to become permanent. Property law, at its core, is just a very old, very human attempt to answer a question that used to be settled entirely by force. Who gets to stand here? Every deed, every recorded description, every county office quietly filing paperwork nobody will ever read unless something goes wrong, is part of a system built to make sure the answer to that question doesn't depend on who has the bigger sword. It's not perfect, it's run by people, and people occasionally paste the wrong paragraph into the wrong document, but it corrects itself again and again because it was built by people who understood that mistakes were inevitable and designed a process to survive them anyway. So go read your deed, not because you're about to discover you secretly own a suburb, you almost certainly don't, but because the 5 minutes it takes to check is the exact 5 minutes that separates every calm homeowner from every headline we talked about today. Do the boring, careful thing now, so the ordinary parts of your life, the mortgage payment, the mailbox with your name on it, the quiet certainty that the house you're standing in actually belongs to you, get to stay ordinary. But that's just a theory, a catastrophe theory. Thanks for not ruining your life.